This UCSD TV program is a presentation of University of California Television. Your support makes UCTV's programming possible. Contribute online at uctv.tv/support. Check out the YouTube original channel UCTV Prime at youtube.com/UCTV Prime. Subscribe today to get new programs every week.
Thank you for joining us this evening for our Exploring Ethics program here at the Sanford Consortium Collaboratory. I'm Mike Kalichman. I'm Director for the Center for Ethics in Science and Technology, and I'm also professor at UC San Diego. As many of you already know, the Ethics Center is not interested in only talking to the public. We want to hold conversations that involve the public, to engage people, to hear their perspectives as well. Because we're interested in the ethical dimensions of science and technology, one of our main concerns is to understand how science should be done. How should we conduct the research that we do? There are many questions we address, but that's one key question we often look at. And that's directly a question we have tonight. This program is the first in a series of 3 programs that will be looking at the question of collaborations between academia and industry. Just for a bit of brief background, you should know that this program was conceived beginning about 3 months ago when Dennis Ryan of Pfizer approached me to ask about whether there might be some way we could have a conversation at UC San Diego about this challenge, that some people see problems that have occurred in the past around academic industry collaborations, and he thought it might be useful to have a conversation within the university to figure out how to deal with that better. As we talked, we realized there are 2 kinds of problems. Some are the real, definite problems that might occur, and some are the perceptions about problems that may or may not be real. Given the perceptions question, I proposed that maybe it would be useful to have this as a topic for one of our public programs. And we took that question to Dwayne Roth at Connect, and Dwayne helped to put together what has become this series of 3 programs that are all focused on academic industry collaborations. To have support for the program, we were very fortunate to receive first matching funds from the Legler-Benbow Foundation here in San Diego, which has supported the Ethics Center in the past. And those funds were matched by support from Pfizer, from Takeda Pharmaceuticals, and from Johnson & Johnson. In addition to all of those partners, UCSD TV, which is filming the program today, is providing in-kind support in part as well to help make this program possible. Now clearly, with all of these different partners, this is intended to be a community conversation. This is not to serve any one organization or constituency. So we want to encourage, in that context, respectful discussion. We want you to be prepared and willing to ask tough questions, but remain respectful of the different views that might be present in the room. Only if we do that can we do better than we're now doing. It's not that we're doing terribly now, but we hope we can do better in terms of our academic industry collaborations. I'm going to say a few things to frame the discussion before we formally get started with the rest of the program. And I'll begin with some readings that you can find linked on the Ethics Center's website if you haven't already seen those. One of them is a report that just came out from the American Association of University Professors on academic industry collaborations. And in that report, they summarize something that I suspect most of us would agree with, and that is that collaborations between industry and the academy present tremendous opportunities for advancing knowledge, applying it to real-world problems, and bringing about myriad social benefits. Cooperative research agreements involving both university and industry scientists have proven critical to the development of numerous powerful technologies in medicine, agriculture, energy, and other fields. So that's the good news. However, at least from my own personal experience, and maybe from some of you, there are other perceptions out there. One is that industry is driven only by profit motive, and they would sacrifice the best interests of patients and the public for the purpose of making more money. Another perception is that those in academia are driven only by finding more funding and getting more grants and getting more publications, that they are prepared to operate sloppily as long as they can get more money. Now, I'm not going to say that either of those perceptions is 100% true, but neither of them is 100% false either. You will find examples of both in academia and industry. Our question for today is to figure out to what extent those perceptions might be true and what we can do about it. The AAUP report that I've mentioned cites some examples, and I will just read very briefly 4 of them of some things that have occurred in the past. I will leave it to you to decide whether they are all as bad as they might appear on the surface, but one is cases of companies and academic investigators failing to publish negative research results from industry-sponsored clinical trials or delaying publication for a year or more after trial completion. Second, academics putting their names on manuscripts after the data were collected and analyzed and after the first drafts had been ghostwritten by industry-paid authors. Third, nominally independent science organizations established and systematically funded to steer public discussion and debate, serve corporate business interests, and stall government regulation to the detriment of the university's overarching mission of developing and disseminating reliable public knowledge. And finally, final example, industry heavily funding clinical practice medical guidelines and the academics who write them. Now, again, whether or not these things are widespread, whether or not they occur, you can imagine situations where some of those things might be in part good, and situations where they might be bad. However, the fact that there might be bad behavior having occurred does not mean we haven't gained a great deal from academic industry partnerships. Pfizer has a pamphlet, which is one of the things linked on the website as well, which describes, I think, very nicely and succinctly what we get from both sides. The success of academia is the result of the unconstrained pursuit of knowledge about a particular disease or pathway. With multiple sources of funding for basic research, academia has the intellectual freedom to explore and discover. On the other hand, industry brings together the considerable human and financial resources necessary to translate an academic theory or discovery into a therapeutic entity. The inherent structure of pharmaceutical companies allows them to make targeted investments in therapies and introduce them into clinical practice. We want to help find a way to make that partnership work as well as possible. So in this first program, in a series on meeting the challenges of conflicts of interest, we want to explore which problems are real, which are only likely speculative. The overall question to be addressed tonight or this evening is what have been the challenges to academic industry collaborations? Embedded in that general question are several specific questions. You might think of others, but some that come to my mind are what benefits have we gained from academic industry collaborations? In what ways have those collaborations been problematic? What are the likely causes of those problems? And finally, what is the difference between those problems that are real and those that are only perceived? And does the distinction matter? So to deal with these issues, we probably could not have done better than the 2 panelists we're fortunate to have here with us this evening. Dr. Gary Fierstein on my left is Director of the Clinical and Translational Research Institute and the Dean and Associate Vice Chancellor of Translational Medicine at UC San Diego. He worked in industry for several years before returning to UCSD in 1996. He has received many awards in recognition of his research on the pathogenesis and treatment of rheumatoid arthritis. And in 2011, he became the scientific founder of, actually I don't know how it's pronounced, is it NextX? Or do you know?
NextDX.
NextDX, an epigenetics company in San Diego. And to his left is Dr. Jeremy Barton, who is Vice President of Oncology Clinical Research in Pfizer, La Jolla. He trained in internal medicine and practiced for 11 years in the United Kingdom's National Health Service. For the past 20 years, he has held a variety of positions in large pharmaceutical companies in Switzerland and in the UK, and biotech companies in the United States. As noted in his biography, his particular interest at Pfizer is in the interface between research and early development through to proof of concept, Throughout his industry career, he has participated in numerous preclinical and clinical collaborations with academic institutions and cooperative groups on both sides of the Atlantic, which have been instrumental in advancing the progress of compounds towards regulatory approval. So I've asked Drs. Fierstein and Barton to each take a few minutes to highlight some of their experience as well as their perspectives about the issues we'll be addressing this evening. Following their remarks, I will engage them briefly to address a few specific questions, which will be followed by an opportunity for you to not only ask questions, but to offer your insights and perspectives. As I have noted in previous programs, for those of you who haven't attended those programs, it is your ethical responsibility to participate in that conversation, to help us think through these issues. I don't want anyone to think there are other experts of other kinds in this room. I don't have something to offer. We all have something to offer. We want to hear your questions. We want to hear your ideas, or at least as many as we can fit into the time we have available. So be thinking about what you would like to add to the discussion this evening. So having said all of that, I'm going to turn it over to Gary Fierstein, and he will take some time to tell us what he has to say.
Thanks very much. So my suspicion is that most of the interesting content this evening or this afternoon will be driven by the conversation that we have. And I think I would just like to make a couple of relatively brief introductory remarks related to how industry and academics interact. And one of the most essential components of understanding these unique interactions is the relative division of labor between the expertise in academia and the expertise in the private sector, which is complementary and partially overlapping, but clearly have in many ways a different focus. So on the academic side, the primary missions, aside from teaching, as well as, at least in a medical school, seeing patients and teaching clinical medicine, is essentially the free-form creation of new knowledge. We are interested in understanding disease pathogenesis, understanding how we might be able to intervene in those diseases or develop new ways of diagnosing them, or understanding their outcomes, using novel research or molecular techniques. On the other side, but what we're not very good at actually is taking a discovery and commercializing it. So for example, there is a robust discussion going on at the NIH right now in terms of what academics should be doing in terms of drug discovery. There's the notion that we should be creating essentially nonprofit drug companies that do high throughput screening, then do medicinal chemistry, and all the steps that go into taking an idea to a compound to a therapeutic. If only it were that simple, and I think my time in the 1990s in industry was very instructive in that regard, and it requires actually teams of scientists who are not so much interested in writing grants and publishing papers, but whose jobs are primarily to move a project from stage to stage. That's almost impossible to do within the context of an academic career. So, I've been arguing with my colleagues that we should recognize what we do best in academia, which is primarily innovation and many of those early steps, and then partner for the later steps, which is particularly in industry, either pharma or biotech, that can muster the resources and the personnel to do all those things that would not be feasible within a grant-driven society, environment like academia, where you can't afford to have a 90% failure rate for a particular project. If you're an academic and you're writing grants to have your research survive, you have to continually be funded. Industry is designed to be able to withstand significant failure and still be able to, at the end of the day, support its missions. So on the other hand, On the industry side, the focus on these teams makes it very difficult, particularly in today's era, to develop, to really support the basic science and innovation that could then be translated. This was actually done quite a bit, I think, during the 70s, 80s, and 90s when the biotech era was first getting started. And there was quite a bit of innovation that could go on within the context of pharma. But at this point, the pipelines are thinner, and pharma really has a need to look at earlier innovation that occurs within the academic setting. So I view actually these interactions as a division of labor that are complementary and that can't be successful without sorting out the issues that allow us to basically do what we do best, and essentially being true to each of our missions, because the overlap in those missions is ultimately what is best for patients, and that can either be constructed as an interesting line of research or developing a therapeutic that can be commercialized that will be beneficial and will develop a market. So those are my brief introductory remarks.
So I can really actually only echo what Gary said. Speaking from the industry perspective, I think you highlighted very nicely most major pharma companies now are experiencing a huge dearth in products, either products going off patent, they fail in late phase. Target identification is a huge problem. And just as Gary said, I think who are better people to identify new targets, new disease mechanisms than academia? And really, I think in the last few years, there's been an increasing realization from pharma that the best way to proceed to maximize the skills on both sides from academia and pharma is some form of collaboration with the target identification, the disease mechanisms, those ideas coming from the basic scientists, the academics, and then what pharma does best clearly is to develop drugs, to manufacture them, to get them approved, and to commercialize them. I did a quick count actually of the number of big academic industry collaborations over the last 3 or 4 years, and in the major pharma, I think I counted about 28 companies had formed collaborations with academia. And I think just yesterday I read Boehringer Mannheim has formed a translational medicine collaboration with Harvard to look at mechanisms, signal transduction mechanisms and targets in a variety of therapeutic areas. GlaxoSmithKline has signed up with Cambridge University, and in what they call an open innovation centre in Cambridge, UK, they will have scientists from the university working alongside scientists from GlaxoSmithKline at their research centre. And then to take a more clinical focus, Bristol Myers has signed up a deal with Emory University for phase 2-3 studies. So I think the general message I take is there is huge potential which pharma can only ignore at their peril given past track records and inability to innovate or bring forward new targets. So I see that as the way forward, and just as both of you outlined, this is going to be or highlight some significant challenges for the future. And so looking back over 20 years in the industry, I see a change in the way that industry has gone about this. 10, 15 years ago, industry might go to the academics and say, hey, we've got an experiment we'd like you to do. This is what we would like you to do. Please do it. And it may or may not be done. Now I think the trend is pharma is coming to academia saying, you know, we're looking into new mechanisms of disease in these particular therapeutic areas. How can we best work together? And I think this builds on the expertise in academia. And I think the secret for success here is collaboration and sort of aligning mutual interests. Pharma is pretty good at forming alliances and collaborations in terms of laying out the goals and the milestones and so forth. And I think part of the lack of success or indeed downright failure of the past has been really not making clear what expectations are. I mean, I can draw from personal experience in some preclinical collaborations. Investigator has got some drug, we've agreed in broad level, these are the sorts of experiments we'd like to do, and then 2 years later, hey, have you got any data yet? Now I think we're being a little bit more rigorous in the way we structure things, and I think clarity up front dispels or prevents a lot of potential disappointment further down the line. And hopefully, as we gain experience with the collaborations along the lines of what I've described and what Gary has described, it will be to mutual benefit of both. Advancing science for pharma, of course, it's advancing science in a very focused way, because ultimately we need to generate some profit at the end. But again, matching expectations at the beginning, I think, may go a long way to do that. And I don't want to downplay in any way the challenges that can accrue from this. And I think as these collaborations I've described, which really just seem to have kicked off in the last 2 or 3 years, we will learn from those experiences. And I can only hope that if we have this discussion in maybe 5 or 6 years' time, we will be able to reflect on what we've learned, what we've gained, and hopefully have dealt with some of the issues which undoubtedly will come up in the subsequent questioning.
So if I could just add one thing. So the notion of people understanding what the expectations of the other side or the collaborator might be is important. So in academics, nirvana is infinite funds allowing you to do a random walk of science that is responsible to nobody. And in the role of the sponsor, in pharma, it is no money and do the following experiments for me and give me the results and all the intellectual property that comes from it. So in reality, it ends up being somewhere in between. And so in academia, you're used to working on grants primarily, not in contracts. And so you're not used to working with milestones and quarterly reports and making sure that you're providing, doing due diligence for each step along the way in a particular research pathway. But that's actually what's required in order to make a goal-oriented project go forward. And on the other hand, pharma hasn't quite figured out exactly how to deal with academia. And I think that's in part represented by the multitude of different structures of those 28 collaborations. They're actually all over the place in terms of, do you have a global agreement that covers multiple areas, or do you cherry pick just a few individual projects? They're pretty much all over the place. And then so the idea is, how do you provide funding that permits the academic to continue doing what they do best, but still, which is, again, innovate and provide sometimes a wandering pathway that gets you to something very interesting, but still get what you need at the end of the day, which is the data that's going to move the project forward.
Yeah, and I think that will be the learning experience. I mean, from what I understand, many of the approaches at the moment, and as you said, there's a whole spectrum, are the more general ones. We're interested in new targets in this particular disease, and targets is the end point there. How it then subsequently evolves, you've got a target, is it druggable? How do you interact with the pharma company to generate the molecules? How you collaborate maybe to use the pharma's technology if they want an antibody panel or phage display or what have you. I think it will be a learning process, but I think time will tell, and like you said, we will probably experience a whole range of different collaborations, and we'll learn from which ones of those worked and which ones didn't work. But I think, we will have to see. I mean, I think at this point it's too early to say, because as far as I can see, from all these 28 collaborations, I haven't really seen anything published that indicates their success. Of course, I don't know what the goals were, whether the more open-ended ones or whether they had deliverables which weren't met. And then this is another question, the data weren't published. I mean, I don't know.
Well, and in fairness, it might take some time. I mean, more than a couple of years for something to come through. So just for numbers, just for people to know, so we say 28 collaborations, that's 28 companies that have engaged in major collaborations with the universities, but I'm guessing that multiple companies have engaged with multiple universities. Right. So that's actually more collaborations total that have that model than 28.
Yes,
right?
Indeed.
So, do you know what that total number would be, or?
I don't have the figures. I mean, it's not double that, but it's probably half as much again.
Yeah. And Based on what I've heard from the two of you, I mean, it raises a sort of an overall question for me about different models and which works for getting useful drugs to market. Let's make it as simple as that question. Before 1980, which I know is before your times, but before 1980, my recollection, and from what I understand, is that there was relatively little push in academic medical centers to have industry funding. In fact, I remember I just finished my PhD in 1980, coming back to UCSD and seeing an environment in which it was seen as a sign that you weren't good enough to get federal funding if you had a relationship to industry and had funding from industry. Then in 1980, we had the Bayh-Dole Patent Reform Act. And correct me if you have different perceptions of this history, but the Bayh-Dole Patent Reform Act then opened up the opportunity for universities to negotiate the intellectual property issues that came out of work when they collaborated with industry. And that was the opening of a door that we continued to see the rise in expectations to the point now where my guess is that most faculty who are very successful in the School of Medicine actually do have relationships to industry. It is certainly not looked down on. At least my perception is that it's not. So is that true? Is that you?
Well, I've read about Bayh-Dole in the history books.
Right, okay, good.
So you're quite right that there were really very few industry collaborations in the early 80s and then even actually into the 90s. And it really is proliferating, and it is in part driven by extrinsic factors like funding levels at the NIH. So if you wanted to see an explosion of biotech collaborations in the early 90s, that was a dip in federal funding that is very similar to what we have today with single-digit pay lines, for instance, for grants. And so, people have to fund or need to find ways to fund their research, and they're very opportunistic. I actually do think that we live at UCSD in an environment that is actually much more open to these collaborations than other universities. And even within our own university, there are still significant numbers of faculty who believe that collaborations with the private sector are somehow not as pure or not desired. They're not the coin of the realm. And I still see in academic files that are reviewed where somebody who has abundant industry funding, and it says, yes, they've done well, but they don't have an NIH grant. And that's used as a strike against them in terms of their academic career. So I still think, although it's less, I still think that there is a significant sense among academics that the preferred route is peer review grant funded research. But I think that number is dwindling.
Yeah, so it's clearly probably moved in that direction.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an element of necessity, as you said. I mean, federal budgets, NIH budgets are going to be cut again next year. And in order to get, I guess, the scope of research done, they will need to look to alternative sources, which I guess raises another issue. If you've got funding from pharmaceutical companies, from federal sources, from other sources, how do you juggle the expectations of all your interested parties together? But I mean, I guess it's a fairly trivial remark, but I mean, speaking in my own field, oncology, to answer the question about the numbers of collaborations with industry and academia, 20 years ago, 30 years ago in oncology, you had cytotoxics, which basically had one or two mechanisms of action. Couple that with the fact that industry was on a high then. I mean, I worked in pharma companies in the early 90s where they didn't have budgets because they had so much money. Glaxo, it was Glaxo then. They had Zantac. It was turning over about £9 billion, so multiply that by 1.5 a year. They could not spend money fast enough. They had no need. They had no compulsion to look outside. Now, as we talked about at the beginning, it's the very reverse situation that the whole field has become a lot more complex. The lower hanging fruit have gone. You're going to need to take the next extra steps. And companies don't have the infrastructure to invest the type of resource and get the type of expertise that exists outside. So I think there's an absolute element of need from the pharma company's side. How can we convince the more skeptical academics? I think back in the late 90s, there was a particular scandal with a version of thyroid hormone replacement. I think it came from Boots. And they did a study fully expecting to show that their version of thyroid hormone was better than the cheap generic. And the study they did showed exactly the opposite, that the generic was significantly better and a third of the cost. And there was a huge attempt by Boots not to get the data published, or to at least conceal it or throw doubts on the credentials of the investigator, who they said was in the pay of the generic company, and it was a whole debacle. And it prompted the then president of Harvard to say the price of corporate support is eternal vigilance. And I mean, there's an element of truth in that. And like you said at the beginning, there are always going to be bad stories of the motives of pharma companies, and they can withdraw funds at the drop of a hat. They're going to conceal imperfect results or results that don't fall in line with what they would like to see. And we have to deal with that. And as I'm sure all of you know, there are now significant regulations in place from Pharma Manufacturers of America, from the American Association of Medical Colleges, and from the NIH in terms of how investigators should conduct themselves. There are indeed, I think, dealing with the publication issue, there's a group that was initiated 2 or 3 years ago representing the publishers of major journals and pharma companies of how to deal with the issue of making public results from studies, appropriately designed studies, and not concealing information that could impact negatively. So hopefully, as people step back and look and see that pharma companies do acknowledge the issues and the challenges, and steps have been made, I think, to deal with some of the concerns, we will start to redress the issue.
Yeah, so all of this, brings me back to this other question, though, of this history, and I think it's fair to ask, sort of an out-of-the-box way, if the goal is new medicines that might help people deal with diseases that we face, then the question is, before 1980, before the Bayh-Dole Patent Reform Act, how well were we doing in terms of producing those medicines? Once the Bayh-Dole Patent Reform Act was passed, did we just do better when NIH funding went down so that people started working with industry? Or was there a continued increase? And were any times we got something, was it simply that it was low-hanging fruit that could have been found by industry on its own or without academia? So what can we look at to say that there actually is value in that we can talk theoretically about the academic value, but is there evidence here that says that without the academic role, we wouldn't have gotten where we are?
Well, I think, again, it's hard for me to comment much on what was going on pre-1980. Okay. But what is clear is that whatever it was that conspired for the biotech revolution beginning in the late 80s, when companies such as Amgen were being formed, and then in the 1990s when companies were being formed every day, these companies were coming out of academia primarily. They weren't just a bunch of people that had a new idea on their own and then decided to start a company. It's almost always intellectual property that came out of a basic science lab that led to ultimately commercialization of erythropoietin or granules, a GCSF or something like that. So that, I think, was, and San Diego was, for some reason, uniquely situated to take advantage of that, because we had a very entrepreneurial faculty and a permissive regulatory environment in San Diego that allowed companies to form in the Sorrento Valley and other locations. So I didn't want to imply that it was simply just because money was disappearing from the NIH. There were multiple things that were going on. Companies were coming out at an alarming rate from academia, and those individuals that were staying in academia were also looking around for other ways to fund their research. So all these things are going on at the same time. Now, I do think that a lot of the drugs that came out in the 70s and perhaps even the 80s were not what we would call today targeted therapies. People didn't know how Valium worked actually when it was approved. It was done through traditional pharmacology methods. And then you pointed to sort of the low-hanging fruit, antihypertensives for blood pressure, statins for cholesterol. These required innovation, but they were not, I think, hugely difficult drug targets by and large. And we're now to the point where we're probably past the era of the giant blockbuster that everybody takes. It's getting to an era where you need to have precise definitions of what an individual's disease are, and then have tailored medications towards that particular individual. We sometimes call it personalized medicine. And that's something that is now beyond the low-hanging fruit. We can't just go out and pick an enzyme and then assume, like with statins, that you're going to be able to treat, I don't know what percentage of the population takes it, but a lot of people are going to be taking that one medicine. It's going to be much more segmented in terms of drug development, and I think that's going to require substantial investments in the basic science. That's not, again, really possible through pharma.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And to your point about what drugs have come through academia, you could actually, and something Gary said, you could regard biotechs as a sort of middle step, because a lot of biotechs were spun out from academics. And then what does big pharma do? Well, it buys up the biotechs, because the biotechs have an inability to take their molecules through perhaps to the late stage. But I mean, also you said now the complexity of drug development with targeted therapies and the need for companion diagnostics, it's really beyond the scope of small companies. But I think I would have to think about, the two drugs that stick in my mind that came from academia in oncology that were blockbusters were the taxanes that came from the NIH back in the 70s. And more recently, a drug that was just approved for prostate cancer, abiraterone, which came out of the Cancer Research Campaign in the UK and was taken through early phases in the Royal Marsden Cancer Centre and backed up by the laboratory, and was then bought out by a biotech company who was subsequently bought out by Johnson & Johnson. But you can see a chain now, and I guess the bottom line is that regardless of the source of those molecules, they're going to have a final common pathway, I think, to big pharma for targeted therapies to maximize their potential.
So, but if we take Gary's comment together with big pharma's goal, does that mean that big pharma's hope that these collaborations with universities will actually result in some more blockbuster drugs might actually be questionable, and that they're going to be lucky to find some bits and pieces?
Well, it depends how nihilistic you are about the future of drug development. We're going to have to search an awful lot harder to find novel targets, that's for sure. And whether a single target hit that is going to be sufficient, or whether you need combinations of therapy, that's an open question. I don't know.
Well, yeah, I can't speak for my pharma colleagues, but when I talk to people that work within industry, there is less and less a focus on trying to find the next lipitor, the largest drug, I think, in history, and more towards the model that companies like Genzyme might have, which is to find a relatively smaller market that has to take your particular medication and then charge a significant premium for it.
Well, let's just say charge enough so that you can make a reasonable profit on it.
No, that's actually an important point. I have actually no problem with the profit margins and being able to have sufficient money so that the company survives and can support failure.
Okay.
But the question then becomes, can our society then sustain premium pricing for everything? Which is basically what personalized medicine is about right now. It is identifying a group of people that are perfectly tailored for your particular medicine, and then because you're not giving it to 50 million people, you're giving it to 50,000 people. Can you charge enough to allow you to develop that one, sell it, and then still have 20 other failures to pay, pay for 20 other failures with that success?
It sounds like a good topic for another future program to look at how that economic model can work out. But I think, sorry, Jerry.
No, I was going to say that's your next session, your personalized medicine
Well,
session.
the next session is on personalized medicine, but I think this, maybe we'll end up getting into this question, but I mean, I think I can see an entire, at least single forum on that question of how do you balance that ability to get the
That's
costs.
what personalized medicine is.
Yeah.
It is narrowly targeted medications.
Absolutely.
And just one comment, the market does actually bear the costs. Again, oncology, the latest 2 drugs that have been approved, which are targeted for melanoma patients and Pfizer's own lung cancer, which is targeted against 5% of lung cancer patients, those both retail about $100,000 per course per patient. But the corollary of that is that they are extraordinarily effective. And as Gary said, you're not treating 40 or 50 or 60% of people who don't respond. You're treating whatever, 5, 10, 15% who 80 or 90% respond. And that's, I think, how the markets judge those drugs. But
So what I want to do now is open this up to questions, and we have 2 microphones, and what I would like to ask you to do is just, you can line up at the microphones, which means everybody's going to get up at this point. But if you've heard things that you disagree with, that you have an answer to, that you can add to the conversation, want to encourage you to hit the microphones. And since you've raised your hand, you're welcome to walk over to one of the microphones, and others are welcome to do the same. And if you don't, it's showing that you're unethical, so remember that. So you do want to start thinking about...
I thought we weren't being documented. I was just moved to respond to the last comment about Genzyme's business plan, which involves charging hundreds of thousands of dollars a year per patient. And I just wonder who's going to pay, when you broaden that out. I don't see Medicare being able to cover those sorts of level of expenditures.
That's the next
Is that a
session.
rhetorical question, or one in which
That's
you
an
hope somebody has an
absolutely
answer?
literal question. Who's going to pay for that sort of business model? So many of the big pharmas these days are going after, orphan drug indications where you must have at least $100,000 per year per patient in order to justify the hundreds of millions of dollars that you need to expend in order to get a drug approved. So how long can that go on? And that's not a rhetorical question, it's a literal question.
Not forever.
Yeah, the answer, okay, there's the answer.
Right, I forgot who
I
was it
think-
said,
I
if
think-
something can't go on forever, it won't.
And I think the fair answer, which you probably already knew, is that there is nobody, obviously, that can afford to pay that, so.
One stumbling block that I see in terms of hindering additional collaborations between industry and academia that I see in my experience of being a lawyer who handles the collaborations between the 2 sides is the interpretation of the Bayh-Dole Act that's universally interpreted to vest the IP rights to prevent a university or a research institution who receives federal funds from giving up IP rights to industry, even if it's within the bounds of a project that's fully funded by industry, because there are certain types of research projects that may be more likely to lead to IP, that may be more likely to lead to a certain type of IP that industry would be fearful of losing ownership to. I'm interested and curious to know if you agree that that is a bit of a stumbling block to even more collaborations? And if so, do you think that there would be support, particularly on the academic side, for some ability to have a more official interpretation, whether it be by act of Congress or otherwise, to change the interpretation so that a fully funded industry collaboration or research project does not necessarily fall under the rules of Bayh-Dole that would characterize that as still being an invention made using federal funds?
There you go. Honestly, I'm just not familiar enough with the technical aspects of that to say one way or the other.
I would be in the same camp, I'm afraid.
I apologize.
Okay. Well, if there's going to be a sponsored research project between industry and academia, including the 28 ones that you mentioned, the interpretation of Bayh-Dole is that even if those projects are being fully funded, because the lab itself, some equipment maybe has been purchased using federal funds, or even just some general know-how by the researchers involved have been obtained through federal funds, the general interpretation is that under the Bayh-Dole Act, one of the give and takes in the Bayh-Dole Act was that the government is no longer going to take ownership of all inventions made using federal funds, and instead the institution can retain ownership to it. The interpretation has been such that that's so expansive, so that even an industry project, the commercial sponsor doesn't get ownership in the IP rights, and that's when you end up with structures that involve future options to license and things like that. It's different from the typical service provider industry relationship, and it should be. It's not exactly a service provider industry relationship, but that potential risk of losing the IP rights and actually having to pay money to get a license back to an invention that you paid for in the first place is something that when I counsel clients about certain activities and whether to partner with academia or not, the question has to be asked about the potential for IP rights and whether or not there's an appetite for potentially having to pay again to get a license to it. I would think that if the situation was changed, that there would be even more room for these kinds of collaborations, and in a broader sense, which would increase funding for academia and would enhance partnerships both ways. But I'm not familiar with any efforts to change the interpretation, or whether academia would be willing to support it.
So I actually have seen this come up a number of times, and there are there are ways to manage it. So first of all, some collaborations are actually structured as service agreements, where there is no potential for intellectual property being created. Laboratory service agreements, clinical service agreements, and so on. On the other hand, a research agreement in and of itself does not provide any guarantee or any guarantee of IP. That's something that has to spring from the mind of the inventor as an unanticipated outcome that comes from the research. So I view it as a bonus for the sponsor. And the bonus is we have a research agreement where we're doing the following experiments, and it's research, and we will provide you with the data. if in the course of that I say, aha, I just thought of something novel that was not part of the agreement, it is actually an invention. That actually is not something that could have been anticipated by the research agreement or by the statement of work. And that's something that is difficult sometimes for sponsors either to understand or they don't want to understand it. And that is that this is the bonus that you get for working in academics. That if you want to work in a contract lab where they just do the work and provide you with the data, that's one thing. If you want to work in a university where someone provides has an inventive step that is above and beyond the data, then again, that's the bonus that you get. That's why you work with the university.
And just to
I mean,
make
I
sure
like
I'm
that, but
following
that's-
through here, what you're saying is under that circumstance, the company should not expect to be able to reach in and pull out that independent idea that
Well,
you come up with.
I think that agreements can be, and again, I'm not an expert in writing these agreements, but the agreement can be structured so that the sponsor has an opportunity to license that with reasonable, sometimes even pre-negotiated terms.
Yeah, I would think that from a company's perspective, you would anticipate that up front, and you would say for any such invention or piece of knowledge coming that could lead to a therapeutic, you would have first rights for an exclusive license. I think that would be a sine qua non for a company. I doubt that they would.
That's standard.
But companies feel that they've bought the invention by paying for the research. But what they bought was the data, not the invention.
Well, that presumably is one of the conflicts that has to be dealt with as we move forward with these collaborations. But I mean, presumably that is at the forefront of the.
Good. So even at the last few minutes, we're identifying another area where there might be an issue here.
Yeah, I mean, to me, that has to be fleshed out at the beginning of these collaborations to avoid exactly what you said.
Right, absolutely. And I've seen many research agreements crumble based on this because companies are unhappy with the fact that they paid for somebody else's invention.
Yeah, and more where you've got these sort of more exploratory collaborations rather than do this or do that, look into new disease mechanisms in this or that. Hopefully that's the outcome of that sort of research.
I think that's why the 28 collaborations that you probably saw are more along those lines. They're more open-ended, where there's more of a balance, or the sponsor can see more of a balance of why those shouldn't be necessarily owned by the sponsor. It's maybe in the more middle ground that we haven't touched on, where there's not a set protocol that all the researcher is simply following the protocol as in a clinical trial, but in a preclinical context where an invention really is something unexpected and an aha, but the middle ground where the purpose for the research is really to reduce an invention to practice or otherwise that is more contemplated, but still the sponsor under the Bayh-Dole interpretations simply cannot own it. So thank you.
Interesting final, actually, as it turns out, question. So one of actually final because we're at 7 o'clock, and so I have an ethical responsibility. As people know, in previous programs that we have to finish on time, but I'm sure that our speakers would be happy to speak to you briefly afterwards. First, before my closing announcements, I want to thank our speakers, both who I think have really helped us to think through a lot of key issues here. I want to thank all of those of you in the audience who thought about these issues and are going to continue to talk about these issues. I also think it's important to make sure we thank those who made this program possible, not only UCSD TV at the back helping film this, but the companies and the Legler Benbow Foundation and the companies Pfizer, Takeda, and Johnson & Johnson that have all helped provide support for this program and Connect. So all of those and you made this possible, so thank you for that.